Miles, this is your presentation. Thank you for presenting to us today on this topic.
Thank you, Vicki. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I am Miles Brooks. I'm a travel coordinator with the Office of Tribal Transportation assigned to tribes, various regions of Alaska, and I am sitting currently in my home in Wasilla, Alaska. So thank you for joining me today. I'll turn my camera off here as I get into it, but thank you for joining me today on putting your transportation plans into action, your Tribal Transportation Improvement Program. So before we begin today, for those of you that joined me about a year ago during our LRTP webinar, we're going to see a couple slides that look familiar, and we're going to see this exercise again that we kind of did the last time we met planning-wise about a year ago in the LRTP. And for those that have joined us today, whether you're experienced or whether maybe you're with this program or transportation program for the last couple months or so, and you're still trying to get your feet wet, I want you to think about this question as we discuss the TTIP today, and as we revisit kind of the connection with the long-range plan and the National Tribal Transportation Facility Inventory. And that question I want you to keep in your mind is, where did the project come from, right? Projects in our communities, projects that we kind of happen to see out in other communities, we see them going, but rarely do we stop and think, how did that project get from an idea in someone's head to the actual ground moving? So again, like I said, just think about this as we talk about the next few slides with the connection to the long-range plan, and then think about this and all the steps that were required in a transportation improvement program to actually get the earth moving for your project in your communities. So over our course of our time together today, I'm going to talk about and cover kind of four major components of what I want us to try to get out of today's talk, if you would. First, I want to talk about how the TTIPs relate to your long-range transportation plan, or your LRTP, the acronym, and the National Tribal Transportation Facility Inventory, or the NTTFI. I want to briefly touch upon what a TTIP is and what it is not. We'll move into when and how a TTIP should be amended and or rewritten. And then finally, what I want us to talk about really briefly is how the public participates in developing your TTIP. So as you get your TTIP either drafted or rewritten, what are the steps to kind of make sure that everybody, all the stakeholders involved, the public, agencies, landowners, have that opportunity to comment and influence the outcome of that the TTIP. So our first question today that we're going to kind of briefly touch upon is, how does the TTIP relate to the LRTP and the NTTFI? And like I said, if you joined me last year about this time on the LRTP portion of this series, the next few slides here are going to look real familiar and hopefully, jog your memory on the connection between your long-range plan and your programs and projects. So the link to the long-range plan, right? The development of your TTIP requires a review of the LRTP to determine progress and revisit priorities based on the tribe's transportation goals. TTIP development also involves preliminary evaluation and analysis of your short-term projects and activities. And that's kind of, the sum of what comes out of our delivery guide for our tribal partners that deliver their program through a program agreement with Federal Highways. The concept here is not much different with BIA tribes and even some of the other stakeholders that have to produce transportation improvement programs. State DOTs go through a similar exercise, and MPOs, for those that are in Alaska, the Anchorage area, the Fairbanks area, now up and coming, the Mat-Su area, also go through a real similar process, right? Where they have a TIP and long-range plans and have to analyze the long-range plans to see how that shapes their TIP, right? So really, in a nutshell, what we're going to talk about here in this next coming slides is, how do I get here, right? This bottom right corner of this flow chart, right? How do I get my projects and activities, assuming that I'm going to use TTP funds on those projects and activities? How do I get them to that point? How do I get to a point where I can move dirt or deliver a transit department or a maintenance program? How do I get to that point and making sure that I'm meeting the planning requirements that are of me, as well as ensuring eligibility for the expenditure of those TTB dollars. So if we rewind here and we kind of step back away from the projects and activities and we step back from the TTIP, we kind of go back to the beginning, right? And if we remember the discussion a year ago with the LRTP presentation, or if you need to go back in the future and touch upon this, what you're going to find is, in general, the LRTP, right, or your long-range transportation plan, in a nutshell, clearly demonstrates a tribe's transportation needs and develops strategies to meet those needs. So when we talk about our LRTP, right, there's a bunch of things that go into that process, but what really comes down to it is the LRTP is your 20-year goal of where you want to be, where your transportation system wants to be. It's also an analysis of where you're at currently and identifying those gaps, right, from where you are to where you want to be, right? And those gaps are your transportation needs, and the strategies to meet those needs are things like identifying funding to help make those needs happen. So within the tribal transportation program world, right, we have this LRTP. There is a second kind of component that goes with the long range plan, and that is the NTTFI, or the National Tribal Transportation Facility Inventory. And what the NTTFI is a comprehensive list, a comprehensive database of all the transportation facilities eligible for TTP funding. So as you can see here, the relationship between the long-range plan in the inventory actually goes somewhat hand in hand, in that if you need to add a facility to the inventory or modify a facility in an inventory, or even take out a facility from the inventory, you need to have that long-range plan documentation to support the addition, the amendment, or the removal of that facility. So after you've gone through the long-range planning, right, we've gone through the LRTP update, we've identified the goals, we've made sure those goals are captured in the NTTFI, most specifically for if we're going to do construction work, rehabilitation work, or maintenance on specific facilities, we want to make sure those are in the inventory. The next step in this process to getting towards an approved TIP and ultimately our programs and activities is a pre-project planning phase, right? Because we have the long-range goals in our plan, and we need to get to a point where we can get a programmed project in our TTIP, we've got to ask ourselves some kind of fundamental questions here, right? We really need to understand in our pre-project planning phase, things like how much is our project going to cost, right? There are exercises to at least determine, maybe how much it's going to cost for preliminary engineering and a rough estimate maybe for construction, right? We're going to ask the questions public involvement wise. Are we ready for this project as a community? Was this project always anticipated to be maybe 10 or 15 years out and we're doing it now? Those are questions. Are we ready, right? What other opportunities are going on in the community that might answer that question public involvement wise, right? Maybe you have a water sewer project coming in that needs to be completed before you do your road work, right? Further, we ask about preliminary needs assessment. During our project pre-planning, we talk about what is the need for this project. Looking at things such as safety issues on your road, deaths or serious injuries, right, feed into that needs assessment. If your road's constantly being flooded, right, looking at flooding data, hydrology data helps also kind of give you some preliminary needs on, okay, part of the need for this project is to relieve the flooding pressure on this road through a series of culverts or bridges or other avenues, right? And then, again, this list is not all inclusive, but one final question to kind of consider when we talk about project pre-planning is kind of preliminary environmental and archaeological reviews, right? Are you going to need a pretty comprehensive environmental and archaeological review as part of your project? Or is it just a simple reconstruction project and you might be towards a minor environmental process, such as what is known as a categorical exclusion, right? And that will feed in to some of the discussions and the cost of your project as you get it ready for a TIP. So after you've done those steps here, your long range planning, your pre-project planning, it's time to start taking those goals, those needs, and the projects you've pre-planned for and getting them into your TIP, right? And ultimately, your TIP is a public document that identifies proposed transportation projects and activities planned to be delivered within a 4-year time frame that meet the short-term needs of a tribal community. The program of projects and activities are in part a result of input from the tribal community and other stakeholders. So really, kind of in short here is the second we're going to bring a TTP dollar into the equation, we want to expend it on something, it really, that item, that activity, that program really needs to go through this process here of long-range planning, pre-project planning, and then ultimately approval of a TTIP. So moving forward here, right? The next question I really want us to kind of to think about and explore here is, what is a tribal transportation improvement program? And moving through it, and I just touched upon it here, right? Your TTIP is a list, and there's some key concepts here that I want us to really focus on in this paragraph here, right? So your TTIP is a list of fiscally constrained transportation projects and activities eligible for TTP funding, covering a period of 4 years. Projects and activities must be included on an approved TTIP prior to expenditure of TTP funds. The TTP must be updated every 4 years. However, to better align with changing priorities, it is recommended that tribes review and update their TTP every year. So what does this mean? And I like to break this down in the simplest terms possible when I'm working with my tribal partners. In short, the TTIP documents what the tribe plans to do, when it plans to do it, what it plans on costing, and how it plans to pay for it within the context of spending TTP dollars. So again, this is a planning document, right? And if you notice here on the clauses of this sentence, everything kind of revolves around planning, right? What the tribe plans to do, when it plans it, what it plans on costing, and how it plans to pay for it. And we'll talk a little bit on kind of what that means and what that looks like here in some coming slides. But I want to wrap up analysis of this question, what is a TIP, with what a TTIP is not, right? And this is just a very brief touch point on this. And, you know, we get some of these questions from time to time when we sit down with some of our tribal partners, but I want to be sure to understand what your TTIP is not when you're delivering your program, right? And the first thing I want to touch upon is a TTIP is not your government, or in some cases, even your department's budget, right? This, again, is a planning document, but this TTIP, right, can be used to assist in your process, your department's budget process, if that's a task that you're charged with, right? So I get a lot of questions that my TTIP says I'm spending $50,000 for maintenance, but it's going to cost me $55,000 this year for maintenance. Am I in trouble, or is that a problem? It's only a problem or a difficult situation if you don't have that 55,000, right? So again, that TTIP, when you're developing it, is a projection for 4 years on what these things are going to cost. So very rarely are you going to expend exactly what you program, but you want to be as close as possible. So that's why it's more a planning document than a budget document. Furthermore, the TTIP is not a waiver or a modifier to other federal, local, or financial, statutory, or regulatory requirements associated with projects or activities. So really what this means is, once you get a project into your TIP, let's say, for example, school street reconstruction in your village, just because it's in the TTIP does not mean you've met all the other federal requirements for that project. What that does, though, is once that project is in the TTIP, it is basically said the tribe is ready to go on this project and can expend TTP expenditures on the project, while still maintaining, you still need to meet the other requirements within not only the transportation program, but other environmental, financial requirements that might be subject to you as a tribal government. Third, a TTIP is not a transportation, what I'd call a wish list, right? So a couple slides ago, I talked about a TTIP being fiscally constrained. And what that comes back to is, how does the tribe plan to pay for things? And part of fiscal constraint is funding your projects with funds that are reasonably expected to be available or already on hand, right? So a reasonable expectation that if you say you're going to spend TTP dollars on your project, and your project's going to cost $100,000 and you receive $100,000 annually, and you're going to save some of that money every year, that's a reasonable expectation that you have those funds available. Now, when we talk about reasonably available, right? If you've applied for a discretionary grant and you haven't heard word back yet, we're not in that reasonably expected availability of those funds. So if you say we're going to fund this project with a discretionary grant, but we haven't gotten an award letter yet, we're not quite to fiscal constraint, right? But if you do get that letter saying congratulations on your discretionary grant and that you're matching it with TTP funds, we've now crossed that threshold of fiscally constrained, and we'd go through the TIPA process that we'll talk about a little bit later. Also, a TTIP is not a guarantee of funds or a maximum price for a project or activities. So just because in your TIP, your project is programmed for $100,000 doesn't necessarily mean that that project is going to be $100,000 or that's the maximum price for that project. And also, it doesn't guarantee funds. So if you're anticipating $100,000 for your TTP program next year, and through various levers and events, maybe you only receive 98,000. Maybe the lop off from Congress is a little bit more expected. Just because you have that 100,000 program doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be. It could be less, it could be more. So something to consider there. And then finally, your TTIP is not static, right? It's as dynamic as a tribe makes it, right? If you remember back when I opened up this topic, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, you know, your TTIP is a 4-year plan. And it has to be updated every 4 years, but tribes are encouraged to review that TTIP annually to make sure, you know, that the tribe's meeting their needs, and looking at it to see if there's any changing priorities from your long range plan that need to be addressed in your TTIP. So we've talked about what a TIP is, briefly what it's not. So the next thing I really want to talk about here is when and how a TTIP should be amended and or rewritten, right? So we know that TTIPs have to be done every 4 years. We know there's an encouragement to look at them every year, and what to do if we need to amend it on that annual cycle, or when we should be rewriting our TIPs. So after this section here, amending the TIP, I want to talk about the points where TIPs should be amended. And there's 4 kind of major times when your TTIP should be amended. You could go into a rewrite if you wanted to, but I'm going to focus on the amendment and those 4 kind of triggers that really start your TTIP for amendment. So the first thing I want to talk about is when we add or remove a project or activity from a currently approved TTIP. The second event in which your TTIP should be amended is if we have a major change to project costs that are programmed in an approved TTIP. The third trigger, there is a major change to the project phase and or schedule in an approved TIP. And finally, we'll talk briefly about including a major change to the project design or scope in an approved TIP. So these are the 4 categories, which are kind of like, they kind of change, right? The cost or what the public thought they were getting when they commented on the draft TIP right before it was approved. You know, the definition of major can be not changed, but interpreted in different ways. So I'd best, if you run into these scenarios that we're going to talk about here, definitely reach out to your point of contact at Federal Highways or BIA to discuss, you know, is this a major change? Is this a minor change? And which type of amendment or how heavy of an amendment process am I going to have to go through? So touching here on the first kind of question here, right? Or the first trigger, we talked about amending the TIP when we're adding or removing a project or activity to or from a currently approved TIP. So what we're going to do here is we're going to see a couple brief little 1 paragraph, 1 or 2 sentence scenarios, and we'll walk through, you know, what does that mean? What is adding or removing a project from your TIP here? So in this scenario, the tribal council has directed the tribal DOT to begin preliminary engineering work using TTP funds for new housing subdivision streets. So assuming the subdivision streets are in the long range plan of the tribe, and they've done some pre-project planning on that project, you know, we got to look at our tip, right? And in this example tip here, we kind of look at our project and activities listed on our tip. We see that we have some admin program, we have a planning program, we have a project here for airport road improvement, we have a maintenance program and a transit program, but we don't have anything here for preliminary for a housing subdivision street. So if we're going to add, you know, a project, right, to your tip, right, the council's directed you to begin preliminary engineering work, which ultimately leads to construction using TTB funds. We need to get that project. We need to follow the amendment process that we'll cover later here and get a subdivision street project into your approved tip. The same goes if we're removing a project, right? So if your lone bus used by the Tribal Transit Authority is permanently disabled, the tribe cannot repair or replace the bus nor rent one. As such, the program will cease operations for the foreseeable future. So you got to remember when this tip went out, whenever it was written, right? And we said, hey, we're going to have a transit program. The scope of the program is this. We're going to deliver it at a cost of, you know, from this example, $50,000, maybe $75,000 a year, depending on what's going on. And it was approved. The public commented on it. We support the transit program, et cetera, or maybe we want a more robust program. However that process played out. What it really says, though, is the TTIP, when it was approved, that the tribe plans to deliver a transit program. So if we can't deliver that program, right, there's no modification. This goes beyond a really serious modification. We're eliminating, right, because the mechanism to deliver the transit program is gone, right? And we don't, as a tribe, foresee one happening in the future. We really should update our TTIP, right, to say, okay, this is why we're removing our transit program, to say we don't have the means to deliver anymore. Right? We need to give the opportunity for the public to comment on that, right? Because maybe the public solution is, you know what, we're going to reduce our maintenance plan, right? Rather than eliminate our transit program. So we really need to give the opportunity for the public to say, what is the priority, right? If we don't have a bus anymore and we can't do transit, well, maybe the transit program is more important than maintenance, right? And we change our priorities. We change our project funding sourcing around to keep that transit program going. But if the public doesn't have that opportunity, right, to analyze that plan, that short-term 4-year plan, they really miss out on the public engagement on the public's transportation system or their program. Moving on here, we should be amending our TIP if we're accounting for a major change to project costs that are programmed in a currently approved TIP. So in this situation, we have an engineer's estimate for the airport road improvement project is $1.5 million, $600,000 more than the TTIP program cost. The tribe has the funds to cover the difference and still plans to go construction. So if we look at this detailed project page example from an imaginary TTIP here, we can see a project name, we can see the scope, and we can see kind of the rough project schedule here, right? We can see that construction is estimated to cost $900,000 when this TTIP was written, and that we anticipated going it over the course of 2 seasons. Now, part of that preliminary engineering process, like this mentioned, we're coming in $600,000 more. That's a pretty significant change to the project cost, right? So we need to amend our TIP to account for that. And again, this gives the public that opportunity to influence their program, right? Because it's that $600,000, well, the tribe has it, right, to cover the difference and can go to construction. The public still needs to be afforded that opportunity to say, if that $600,000 is to be advanced to that construction, maybe that $600,000 is saved for another project that needs to happen, but you still have to give that opportunity to really influence on this whether the changed cost is what the public wants. Now, I'd recommend if your construction's budgeted for $900,000 and your estimate comes back at $950,000, you're probably not really in amendment territory. You're not looking at a significant change. And again, your tribe can adopt policies on what constitutes a major change to your project costs. And I'd reach out to your POCs for that discussion if you want, or just talk to them and get guidance on whether, you know, is $600,000 a significant change? Is it a ratio? Is it a flat dollar amount? But all those questions can be asked when they come up But be assured, if you see a major change, talk to your POC and talk to about amending your TTIP. And you can see here, right, through this process that they've crossed out the construction here. They're going to adjust their construction budget. And then when we'll talk about the amendment process, they put it out, right? They'll put it out for public comment to make sure that's what the public wants. We also need to amend our TTIP if there's a major change to project phase and or schedule, right? So in this scenario, right, the airport road improvements running behind schedule, the PE for the project, and will now occur this year and next year. The change will push construction back a year. However, the PE delay will allow for construction to be completed in 1 year instead of 2. So if we come back to our imaginary TTIP here for Airport Road, we can see that preliminary engineering was supposed to be only for 1 fiscal year, and that construction was supposed to start in FY3. But coming back here, we can see that, okay, PE's behind schedule, and we're going to have to push construction out another year from when it started, but it's only going to take 1 year to do it, right? So maybe they found some efficiencies, right? But again, giving the stakeholders, maybe this construction was split up in 2 years for other logistical reasons or other project purposes, right? We need to have the public that ability to analyze what the change might do. What is the change of putting our preliminary engineering over the course 2 years might do, right? So we're going to work on our amendment. We're going to account for our new PE running behind schedule. And we're also going to account for our new construction timeline, right? The budget didn't change, but we're going over the course of 1 construction year rather than 2. So we'll go through that process. We'll put it out following the amendment process that I'll talk about in a little bit. And we capture that, right? We've amended our TIP to kind of account for a major change to the schedule. Now, if you're running a couple months behind, does that really constitute a major change? I don't know. It's kind of up to your policies and your procedures and your conversation with your POCs to determine that. But when you start pushing back a fiscal year or changing a schedule from 1 year to 2 years or 2 years to 1 year, those kind of major structural changes really start to, I think, get you into the amending TTIP area. Finally here, what I want to talk about, the last point of when we should amend our TIP is when your project has a major change to the design or the scope. So again, using our airport road example here, right? During the PE, it was discovered that an additional 1,000 feet of airport road can be designed and reconstructed for approximately the cost program in the current TIP. The additional work proposed now from 6,012 feet will go from landfill road to barge landing, but it still supports the goals identified in the tribe's LRTP. So we can see here in the original project, the project scope, we were gonna go from landfill road to school road, which is about 5,012 feet. And we have our improvements in our scope, and we can see, here's our budget. And if we come back to the scenario, we're changing our scope, right? We're no longer going to School Street, but we're gonna go to barge landing ray. So we need to update our scope, right? Where we change the scope, project termini, and the length. The improvements remain the same. And as we discussed, our project budget really isn't going to change because the estimate, has captured that change of work for about the same cost. And again, this will go out for public comment because, that when we put this TIP out for comment, there was a scope that the public thought was going to happen within this 4-year cycle, and we're expanding it, right? And again, what constitutes a major change to design or scope? That's a good question as you start to see things change a little bit to work with your POC, right? If we're looking, at this project and through engineering, we decide, okay, we're not going to do the signage, right? We're still going to do our major surface course treatments, the lighting and drainage improvements, but maybe we're not going to do signage because cost, right? It's a good way to keep our costs in the realm. That probably doesn't necessarily constitute a major change to your design or scope. But again, it's good to check, right? If we're changing the design of the surface course treatment, maybe we said we're going to go to gravel and we'll find a way we can actually pave our village street in this scenario, that probably should go back out to public amendment because we are really changing the design from a gravel road to a paved road. So those were the four kind of big triggers when we should be amending our TIP. Next, I really want to cover here is when we should rewrite our TIP. So if we remember to the opening paragraph of this segment, your TIPs are 4-year documents. They should be reviewed annually, but they need to definitely be reviewed and rewritten every 4 years because they do come to the end of their life cycle, right? And basically, there's 2 triggers when a TIP definitely should be rewritten. One, if your tribe currently does not have a TTIP, right? Your TTIP is expired, right? It's not a huge deal if you're not expending any TTP funds, but it's a bigger deal if you're expending TTP funds and you have an expired TIP, right? We really need to get a new TIP written. And then second is if you're doing your annual reviews or for some reason you discover you're in the last year of your currently approved TTIP, it's definitely time to rewrite your TIP. So again, real brief scenarios here, right? What does it mean if you have an expired TIP, right? So for example, if you started as your tribal transportation director on June 1, 2024, as you're discussing the program with your POC, you discover that the most current TIP is from 2023, right? There's no TTIP for the current fiscal year. You should begin working on drafting your new TTIP, right? We know we're in fiscal year 24, well into it, and we don't have a fiscal year or a calendar year 2024 TTIP in effect. We're operating outside of an approved TIP. So we really need to get that updated to at least account for what the tribe wants to expend their TTP dollars on. And that second trigger here on when you should rewrite is if you're in the last year of your currently approved TIP, right? So it's mid-May 2024, it's today, right? And you review your TTIP as part of your normal review process and you notice, hey, 2024 is the last year listed, right? If you do your review earlier in the year, you'll have more time to meet that next year's fiscal year rollover. So if you notice that if you go back after this presentation and you say, hey, I'm going to look at my TTIP and you notice 2024 is the last year on your TTIP, pull your staff together and start rewriting your TTIP. So when the new fiscal year starts on October 1st, 2024, which will be fiscal year 25, you've got a current TIP and you're in alignment with the regulations. So next I want to talk about those amendments or that writing of those TIPs, right? We know the scenarios when we should be amending or we should be rewritten, right? We know if we have some major changes to programmed activities and projects, or we're expired, or we're towards the end of a TIP's life cycle. There's kind of a couple topics here I do want to talk about as we do that, right? 25 CFR 170, which regulates the tribal transportation program, and specifically the 420 series of CFR 170, talk about when those TIPs are, right? They really kind of give you the nuanced details on when those triggers that I just talked about, amending your TIP or rewriting your TIP, kick into effect, and the process for them, right? And so in general, in those regulations, there are basically 2 times or 2 processes you can use to rewrite or amend your TIP. The first one is in a very prescriptive annual update process, which is at 25 CFR 170 423 alpha, or an anytime amendment process at 25 CFR using the procedures at 25 CFR 421. And ultimately, the deciding trigger on your TTIP amendment or rewrite is some sort of tribal government action. So amending or writing your TTIP is not done in a silo by you as a transportation manager or a transportation director, right? But there is some level of tribal government action involved in that, which we will talk about here in the next coming slide. So really in a nutshell, right, an annual update as prescribed in CFR 170, during the first quarter of the fiscal year, tribes are notified either by the BIA or Federal Highways, whoever they're working with, are notified of the opportunity to update your TTIP, right? And that kind of comes back to that annual review, right? You should be reviewing your TTIP annually. So usually that first quarter of the fiscal year, you'll get an email or a phone call, say, hey, you should look at your TTIP. And with that will come, this is what you can expect to see maybe from tribal transportation funding for the upcoming year. Within that process, the tribe, reviews their their TTIP, they look at any new planning of information that might be available to them, you know, new inventory routes, maybe new funding sources. Maybe they rewrote their LRTP last year and it's new this year. So they'll look at that process, right? And then ultimately, if there are changes to the TTIP, they'll update it per the process in 421. And we'll talk briefly about that a little bit later. And then ultimately they'll forward that update, right, to BIA or Federal Highways. If we remember back to kind of those situations where project scopes and designs change, sometimes those don't neatly happen at the end or the beginning of a fiscal year, right? Maybe they happen dead smack in the middle of a fiscal year and you need to update your TIP to account for those changes. That's what this anytime update really kind of comes down to. The procedure for your anytime update really still follows the same procedure as your annual update, but it's a little bit different approach to who initiates or who recommends updates or reviews, right? The anytime update is really brought forward by the tribe when things change in their currently programmed projects and activities. And that, like you see from that second bullet here, that really helps address those project changes, right? Because sometimes you've got to change your TIP and you can't wait to the start of the fiscal year to do so. So that's where the anytime update really allows the flexibility. So when you talk about those two processes, whether you're updating your TTIP in your annual update or your as needed update to address changing project and activity conditions, a tribal government action is needed to help support that TTIP amendment, update, rewritten, et cetera, right? And what really happens is after a lot of the legwork, the public involvement, you've got a real good, solid TTIP, you think it's good to go, and this is what the tribe wants to move forward with projects and activities. It goes through some level of government action. Usually, it'll go through a tribal resolution at your tribal council, right? The resolution does say, you know, we did this, the public involved, these meet our needs, et cetera. And the tribal council recommends approval to, you know, submittal to approval, right? So when you do that, you have your TTIP. When you go to submit it to BIA or Federal Highway for that ultimate approval, it will be accompanied by that tribal resolution or another kind of governmental action certifying that public involvement is incurred. For some of those that might be familiar with this process with Federal Highways, we have that TIP certification, right? That your highest elected leader, right? Whether it's your first chief or council president or whatever, signs that says, you know, we did public involvement, we met all these criteria. This is our official government action asking for approval to the TIP. Once we have that government action, the TTIP is approved by or sent back for further work by BIA and Federal Highways. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a few minutes. But ultimately, right, TTIPs, the only part that really has any type of approval is at the very end. We have a valid TTIP, it's fiscally constrained. Your projects that you want to work on are in your facility inventory. All those kind of checks that we go through, they get approved by BIA or Federal Highways, and that's your TIP that you operate off of, right, to expend those TTP funds. So that's how we kind of do it, the little process here. So what I want to move on to now, though, is I keep mentioning public involvement, stakeholders, right? We want the public to know of these changes, right? Whether it's a new TTIP or whether we're amending TTIPs, right? And really what this really comes down to is 25 CFR 17422 right out of the gate requires public involvement in the development of the TTIP, right? So again, your TTIP is not developed in a vacuum, right? Neither is your LRTP, right? And if it's coming back to your TTIP being the short-term goals or your 4-year plan of projects, your public needs to have that ability to say, these and truly are the ones we want to address in the next 4 years, rather than different ones. So again, that public involvement. After you've done a lot of that work, your draft TTIP is ready for public review, right? The tribe must do a couple things to meet that public requirement, the public involvement requirement, 25 CFR. Most notably, the tribe needs to publish a notice in a local and/or tribal newspaper that it's ready. Now, for those of us today that are with me, we know that newspapers are pretty much non-existent everywhere outside of the rural areas in Alaska. So there is a caveat that if you don't have a local newspaper or a tribal newspaper in your village or with your tribe, you post these notices under locally accepted practices. So what that means is how you traditionally post other important, or tribal government notices, right? You know, maybe there's tribal orders or other kind of important messages that the government posts, right? How you do that for other notices of similar nature are also accepted for the TTIP, right? So if you have a bulletin boards at your tribal hall, washateria, the school, if your tribal council or your tribal government has, you know, a website, email, social media posts, and those are locally accepted at getting the information across, those are accepted. Or traditional mediums, right? Maybe you have radio that you can use, or newsletter or mailers. Whatever those locally accepted practices are, and they're consistent for other types of similar notifications, meet the requirements here for this public notice out to the public. So you have this notice, right? We're going to put it in the newspaper. We're going to have it read over the radio. You send it out in emails to tribal members, etc. What does the public notice need to say? And there are 4 main requirements, right, that the public notice needs to include when you send it out to everybody, right? The first one is that you need to indicate where a copy of the draft TTIP can be obtained. Some tribes say, come by the tribal hall. It's going to be at the transportation office while the tribal hall's open. That meets that standard. Some folks say, visit our website and you can review the draft tip there. Some people attach it to the bulletin board announcement in general, but you just have to indicate where a copy of that TTIP can be attained. Second key piece of information that's required on that post is a contact person for questions on that TTIP, right? So if you, as the transportation director, are in charge of answering those questions, you put your name down, you put your phone number, or put your email or address, however way that the people can contact you with the questions for that TTIP, for that draft TTIP. Also on that notice, you need to provide where comments may be submitted, right? So part of this public involvement process allows for the public to make comments. Either we're not ready for this project, this money can go better to this project instead of this project, or whatever those comments may be. You need to provide where those comments may be submitted. They can be as simple as you may drop your written comments off or have them recorded at the tribal hall between this time and this time. You may say you can mail your comments or you can email your comments to this place, but just a general, you need to provide that medium where they're submitted. And really, and finally here, you need to have a deadline for submitting those comments. Now, traditionally, and you'll see different variations of this, but most TTIPs in some scenarios, 30 days is kind of the open window. 2 weeks sometimes is the open window. What you want to do, though, is if you don't have a policy, you really want to ask that question is, am I giving a reasonable amount of time for members of the public to look at this draft TTIP, consider its impacts, and then submit a comment, right? So if you're putting your TTIP out today and the public comment period closes Friday, you're probably going to get a lot of backlash from your community members, and it doesn't provide a lot of good transparency in your program. But if you publish it today and you close comments, the deadline for comments is 4 weeks from now, that's probably a general accepted, concept, right? The shorter your TTIP draft versus how long your TTIP draft is might also play into that public comment period, right? And finally here, the tribe may also hold a public meeting in which the public may submit comments verbally or writing. So the public meeting is not necessarily required, but we do know a lot of the smaller tribal communities in Alaska like the public meeting model. They'll post the notice, they'll say all these bullets up here, and then they'll say, well, we're also having a meeting on this date where you can also supply comments verbally or written. So moving forward here, right, there's also another type, and you might hear this term be used interchangeably with a public meeting, but I want to be sure we're clear that it's not, is a public hearing. Occasionally, there are situations requiring a public hearing, which is a more formal public involvement process than a public meeting, right? A public meeting, is an opportunity to share what's on a draft tip. Public meetings, is kind of an information sharing, if you would, right? An exchange of information idea. there are situations where projects are pretty complex, both environmentally, publicly supported, funded wise, et cetera, which really gets us to a point where a public hearing is needed. And a public hearing really becomes a matter of public record in the project file as it develops, right? So these, comments that are recorded, the hearings that are held, they're put into transcripts, and they are attached to project records, whether from the environmental side or the planning side or the environmental or the engineering side. It's an opportunity for the public and other stakeholders' comments to be actually included and addressed in a formal manner, right? And so public hearings for a TTIP, an LRTP, or a project must be held in the following situations according to 25 CFR 170-435. So if your project's going to get close to a tip and it's for a new route or a facility, and I'm saying we're going to build a road from village A to village B, and there is not one that currently exists, that is a new route or a facility. We're in public hearing territory. If your public hearing or your project would significantly change the layout or function of connecting or related roads or streets, we're in public hearing territory. If your project would cause substantial adverse effect on adjacent property, public hearing. Or if your project is controversial or expected to be controversial in nature, a public hearing is also required. What I would encourage, if any of these might apply to a project that you might be trying to get into your TIP, I would consult with your POC at BIA or Federal Highways and other involved agencies to determine if any of the above apply. Because many times likely the public hearing will be done or multiple public hearings, if needed, will be done in the pre-project planning stage, right? As you start taking shape, like, you know what, this project's a pretty 50-50 split, right? We don't know if, the public is 100%, right? No projects are ever unanimously supported, right? But if it's going to be really contentious or controversial, we're going public hearing, right? Or if you're in a new route or a new facility, before you even get into your TTIP, you need to have that public hearing, right, to meet this planning requirement. So again, when in doubt and you start flirting with one of these bullets here, consult with your POC. So we're really close to the end here. We're wrapping up here, and I know this is a lot of information, a lot of high level information, but I just really want us to get thinking, of the TIP and what it is and what is it meant to do, and when do you really have to kind of revisit it and how often you should visit it. So I hope we now know, as I wrap up here, is how the TTIPs relate to your long range plan and the inventory. We should know what a TIP is, and we should briefly know what it's not. We covered that for one slide and really broad concepts. We should know when we should and how we should be rewriting or amending our TIPs, right? We should know, what types of project changes, funding changes, design changes, schedule changes should trigger an amendment. And we also know that if we don't have a current TIP, or if our TIPs in the last year of its validity, it's time to start rewriting our new TIP. And finally here, we kind of learned just briefly the minimum requirements and how the public participates in developing the TTIP. So as I close here, I want to just touch upon, this chart here, and this will be probably more as you revisit it and maybe just want to follow the process in your mind on, are we talking about a TIP amendment? Are we talking about writing a TIP as it expires, or as our TTIP expiring? And what you'll notice here in the cycle is that, especially as you write your TTIP, you put it out for comment, you receive comments on it, that sometimes it's not linear. Sometimes you have to repeat maybe your public involvement once or twice, right? Or maybe more, depending on the outcome of the public hearing, depending on, the comments that are received on your draft TIP. Maybe you have to come back and rewrite your TIP, right? Or redo the amendment and go through the public involvement process. Maybe your TIP goes all the way down to the BIA and Federal Highways, and it's determined, we have to return it to you because it's not fiscally constrained. So you kind of have to go back through that process again. So while it seems like there may be a straight line to doing your TIP amendment or rewriting your TTIP to approval, In most cases, excuse me, most times it is a pretty linear process. But be aware there are times where, you know, it might have to go through a round or 2 or 3 of public involvement to really make sure your tip is solid, both fiscally constrained and meets your LRTP goals, et cetera. So hopefully this flow chart does help if you ever come back to revisit this, or you want to hang this on your wall as a tribal employee to say, okay, where am I at in this process? As I need to kind of deliver projects and activities. So as I wrap up here, I want to come back to this question. I hope this was in some people's minds, or maybe we forgot about it, but at least visit this, right? And work backwards, especially if you're a newish tribal employee and you get that question, you get that direction from either your TA or your tribal council that says, go do project X, right? And you need to ask, right, before you start moving earth or before you start doing design on those projects, or even maintenance to some extent on some things, where did this project come from, or where is it coming from? And the first gate working backwards, right, before you want to move that dirt or do that engineering, you got to ask yourself, is it in the TTIP? If I'm being instructed to use TTP dollars to do something, I need to check my TTIP. And if the answer is yes, it's in the TTIP, you're probably good. But if the answer is no, in your TTIP, we need to keep going backwards, right? We need to get that TTIP to include the project. But in order to do that, we got to look back to our long range plan, and we got to look back at our inventory. We got to look at our pre-project planning. So ultimately, this question, wherever you are in the process, I think comes in handy for me, right? When you're getting some sort of instruction, the public's pressuring you, your leadership's pressuring you, or whoever's pressuring you to do something, you need to ask, where did the project come from? And if it is in your tip, it came from the right sources. If it's not, we got to find that roadmap and get it to the T-tip appropriately. So in closing, a couple resources here. I'm not going to read through them all. They'll be here when we post this on the YouTube channel, and the slides are published or whatnot. Some more stuff here. And ultimately, when you have questions about the T-tip, the biggest thing you can do is work with your tribal coordinator with Federal Highways or your BIA POC as you have those questions, whether it's an amendment, if I'm in amendment territory, if I'm in a rewrite T-tip territory, or maybe you have that consultation and you know what, probably nothing needs to be done. Maybe you had a small project cost change, but it doesn't rise to that level of a full-blown amendment. So with that, I know it was a lot of information in about 45 minutes that I've gone through here. I'll open it up. I'll turn it over to Vicky to facilitate if there's any questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat pod, but I haven't been paying attention. And with that, I thank you for your time today. My contact information is here for those of you that want to reach out here on any questions of today or in general. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Vicky.
Well, thanks, Miles. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. People are welcome to post questions either in the chat, the question and answer, or raise your hand, and I will unmute you to ask your questions of Miles. Oh, don't. This recording is going to be posted on YouTube. Just for people's information, there are 2 new additional TTAP webinars coming up in May. Next week, we'll have part 2 of the dust webinar presentation. And then the following week on May 28th, we're going to have someone from the BIA presenting on inventory. So if no one has any questions, I'm going to stop recording